and when they're used up, you end up you end up with a lot of excess bleeding. So it's this paradoxical effect because you have hypercoagulation at first, followed by no coagulation and excess bleeding, just because of a lot of these factors being used up. But basically, having both an intrinsic path and an extrinsic pathway is a way to protect yourself, so that you and also kind of just supplement your clotting, so it just occurs faster. So the intrinsic pathway starts off with your activated platelets. What happens is you have coagulation factor 12, which comes in and it contacts your activated platelet, and it becomes activated by this. And factor 12, once it's activated, it continues basically to be acted on by factor 11. And factor 11 becomes activated, and then again that causes factor 9 to go from inactive stage to an active stage. And all this is occurring like it's occurring right on the platelets. It's very, in proximity it's very close. Obviously the drawing isn't perfect, but this is all happening right there. And so then factor 9 then is able to, with the help of factor 8, it's able to activate factor 10. And factor 10 is really it's your big deal coagulation factor. This is the one that's really is essential. So you have factor 9 with and factor 8 sort of works to facilitate this. It's sort of like an enzyme. I mean, in the way that factor 10 could be activated without factor 8. It's just it would take a ton more time. So with the help of factor 8, factor 10 is much more readily converted into its active stage. And this also requires the help of calcium and the phospholipids, which are found in the glycocalyx of your platelets. So like if this was your glycocalyx, there's the phospholipids in the cell membrane and sort of like the extracellular matrix of the platelet. And so those phospholipids and calcium just kind of acts to hold everything together. You get your activated factor 10. So activated factor 10 then functions to take prothrombin, which is also called factor 2. I don't know why they would name it, and this seems to be very roundabout, but probably a discovery thing. So it turns prothrombin into thrombin, its active form. And it's getting kind of messy here, but again, activated factor 10 is the key to converting prothrombin into the active form thrombin, but factor 5 is important, and so is calcium. So from there, thrombin has a couple of effects. And the reason that I kind of drew 10 coming in here and having all its factors, having its effects near the platelets is because it all needs to be held together, which is really why calcium is so important, is just to keep all these negatively charged factors close to each other, so they're not being repelled, so that all this can happen. Because what we want is inevitably what we want is fibrin deposition, and you want your fibrin to be deposited on your platelets. Not just being deposited anywhere. You want it where you've got your clot formed. So I'm just drawing in more platelets because you kind of have to imagine that you have like a big group now because you've had this aggregation of platelets. So so thrombin, once it's active, it does two things. One is thrombin takes fibrinogen, which has kind of been all over here because it was attaching a lot of the platelets together. And fibrinogen is converted into a fibrin monomer by thrombin, by the active form of thrombin. And these fibrin monomers are basically going to be just put all over your platelets. So these fibrin monomers are just kind of like just covering your platelets and anything else that gets trapped in there. If there's plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, anything else that's stuck in this aggregation of platelets is going to get trapped in there by this. So the fibrin just kind of overlays the clot. And then also thrombin activates what's called the thrombin stimulating factor, which is also known as factor 13. And the thrombin stimulating factor, factor 13, becomes activated by thrombin. And this thrombin stimulating factor takes these fibrin monomers and it cross-links them all. So in the process of cross-linking them all, you end up with this like kind of tightening up of the clot where all these fibrin monomers get pulled together. And what this does is it not only does it bind, does it bind the clot together, but it tightens it up and basically it pulls everything together even tighter so that you end up with the space of the exposed extracellular matrix from where the injured endothelial cells were, end up with that space being tightened up a bit. So then there is finally the extrinsic pathway. You're moving around on me. That's all right. Just confusing me. So the extrinsic pathway it's pretty simplistic in comparison, and it kind of it requires this tissue factor to activate it. But once it's activated, it just skips the steps. So the extrinsic pathway, you have tissue factor released from your subendothelium, and coagulation factor 7 is kind of just circulating in the blood like all the other coagulation factors. And when it comes in contact with tissue factor, it gets into its active form. And when factor 7 gets into its active form, it's able to act on factors 9 and 10. Factor 9, again, is sort of like, it's sort of there to, I don't know, just like kind of as another one of those protective mechanisms. I guess it should go down in here instead, since it's actually creating an active form of factor 9. But it's sort of just one of those protective mechanisms in case of issues with factor 10. But really, what it does is it takes factor 10 from its inactive form and makes it into its active form, just thereby skipping the whole cascade prior to this. And that's pretty much it for how the coagulation pathways occur. People who have hemophilia A, which is an X-linked recessive thing that may be beyond the scope of what we need to know, but they have a deficiency in factor 8, and so the deficiency in factor 8, where's factor 8 in here? There it is. So a deficiency in factor 8, or they could have a mutation of factor 8s, but either way, a lack of factor 8 function basically blocks the coagulation pathway, and it blocks, because of where it is, it blocks both of them. And so that's kind of the reason that people with hemophilia end up being unable to clot and just having basically issues of clotting. And so people who have really severe forms of it who may, be significantly deficient or mutated factor VIIIs. They have a severe form of it, and they're, one of the biggest risk factors is intracranial bleeding, and that can often lead to death in these people. Again, this type of hemophilia A is pretty rare. It's about 1% who have that significant of a illness, but when it is that way, contact sports and really, anything can cause bleeding. People will even have spontaneous nosebleeds, spontaneous GI bleeds. Pretty much anywhere you can bleed, they will bleed. So any questions? And it's a lot. So do you guys remember how aspirin and other NSAIDs affect platelet aggregation?
Do they interfere with COX-1 production?
That's correct, they do. So they actually block the thromboxane A2 synthesis by interfering with the cyclooxygenase 1. I think that's it.